It went from here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think it went up here, possibly to here. I'm not sure. No. And gave forth much more of a sound than the pianos, the Vienna pianos on which he had been playing. And he was very delighted with it. Incidentally, sending a piano from London to Vienna in 1817 was not the simple operation that it would be today. You realize there were no railroads in those days, and that ordinary roads were bumpy and not in too good a condition. This piano was sent by sea. Wherever possible, they transported things by boat. So this was loaded on a dock in London at the Thames, floated out to the North Sea. Oh, and remember too, these were not steamboats. Sailboats floated out to the North Sea, through the English Channel, out into the open Atlantic, past the Bay of Biscay, past the coast of Portugal, in through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, on and on, up the Adriatic to Trieste. There it was unloaded, and it had to be trucked by horse-drawn truck about 350 miles over the mountains before it got to Vienna. You can imagine what a journey this was, what an undertaking. I think the Vienna piano tuners or piano mechanics were not used to these English pianos, and fortunately an English musician was living in Vienna at the time, Cipriani Potter was his name, and he was of some help in getting this thing properly set up in Beethoven's residence. At any rate, he was very pleased with this gift, and this is his letter of thanks to Mr. Broadwood. Now, Beethoven didn't know any English, but he could speak some French. So he writes to Broadwood in rather poor French. This was an answer to the letter announcing that he was to receive this piano. And it did come, I think, a few weeks after this letter was written, 1817. Well, it got around to 1821, or even before, and you can see in Beethoven's music, you can see the effects of this Broadwood piano. Even in Sonata Opus 101, which was composed, he was probably working on it already when the piano arrived. In Opus 101, in the last movement, you get this note in the last movement. And he has to write in the score, contra E, to indicate that it's on purpose, even though you couldn't play this note on most Vienna pianos. But the real thing came about 1821 when he was composing Opus 111. And if you'll recall, the end of the first movement, he has this C major chord, and then the last note, marvelous note, this low note. Now that note could only have been produced on an English piano. There were no Vienna pianos which had this note. And I always call that low C homage à Broadwood. I met a descendant of the Broadwoods in England a couple of years ago, Captain Broadwood, who was still, I think, the titular head of the firm. And in the office there, and he showed me some pictures of the family and this, that, and the other thing. And I showed him this last note of the Beethoven sonata, and he acted, the way he acted, I didn't think he knew it, didn't think he knew about it. So I had this pleasure. All right, next slide, please. Ha-ha! Now, I've spoken about these noisemakers, about these percussion effects that you could get on the piano. Well, there's a type of music that had a great vogue at the end of the 18th century and in the early 19th, for which this kind of percussion would have been very appropriate. The vogue of battle pieces. Now, battle pieces were not exactly new at that time. They'd existed since the Elizabethan days. There's something by William Byrd, I think, called The Battle. And I have, I've seen a piece by Dandrieux in the early 18th century called Les Caractères de la Guerre, in which he has all sorts of incidents of a battle illustrated musically. Well, what is there to a battle? Well, there are marches, approach marches, bugle calls, and fog of battle, attacks, cavalry charges, confusion, cannon shots. That's a wonderful thing. Cannon shots, cries of the wounded, national anthems. Well, you make a medley of all this and give it the name of a battle which is supposed to arouse some patriotic feeling or some interested feeling, and you have a piece of music of a sort. And these things were very popular. There was hardly a battle of the period that was not refought by some poor girl from a piano stool. Now, some of these composers I've mentioned were estimable people, but here we have the great man himself, Beethoven, indulged in this. Of course, this was not just a feeling, oh dear, I ought to write a battle piece. It wasn't quite as simple as that. This was a commercial proposition as far as Beethoven was concerned. Beethoven was on friendly terms, on sort of friendly terms, as much as he ever got with anybody. Terms with a man named Melzel. Melzel, you may know, was the improver of the metronome, not the inventor. He's called the inventor sometimes, but he was the improver of the metronome. And he was a mechanician, pretty good mechanic. And he'd invented all kinds of machines pertaining to music, including a very elaborate type of barrel organ, that is to say, a thing that would make music by a metal cylinder with pins, which would trip valves and then allow air to go through certain pipes and so forth. Barrel organ. You see small-scale barrel organ, you used to, in our American cities. Sometimes the fellow who would come with a monkey, you know, and grind this, he had a barrel organ. Well, now Melzel had a tremendous idea. He invented a new kind of barrel organ which he called panharmonicon, I think it was called. It was a kind of a little orchestra. Various tone qualities be represented, all done mechanically. And the idea was that Melzel would get some very distinguished composer, Beethoven, yes, to compose something and then take the whole thing to England, where the Crown Prince, that is, the Prince of Wales, who later became George IV, Prince of Wales, who was known to be a music lover, might be interested, and this would be tremendous publicity and prestige for the inventor and the composer. So they had this scheme, whereby Beethoven was to compose a piece of music for this jukebox, if you want to call it that, and go to England. Well, now, what kind of a piece of music would it be? A battle piece flattering the English. This, of course, was indicated. Now, it seems that in the Peninsula Campaign, Napoleon's Peninsula Campaign in Spain, Napoleon finally had to quit. He did not make too much headway in Spain because the British took the side of the Spaniards there. The Duke of Wellington commanded the British army and won outstanding victory over the French. This was a check of Napoleon, a hindrance. This was a defeat of Napoleon. And so this was the idea. Beethoven would write something called Wellington's Victory, and it would be put on the jukebox and taken to the Prince of Wales, who would thank him and maybe present the inventor and composer with a golden snuff box, and everybody would be talking about it. So Beethoven composed this. But you know, Beethoven was always Beethoven. He was a very hard man to deal with. And before the scheme could be carried out, he and Melzel quarreled. He quarreled with everybody anyway. And it was called off. But meanwhile, he had the music. So he orchestrated the music for a regular symphony orchestra, and it was called the Battle Symphony, and was performed in Vienna. I understand that it was performed on the same program with Beethoven's new other symphony, the Seventh. But the people much preferred the Battle Symphony, I assure you. Yes. And then, of course, like all music that had any vogue, it got itself arranged for domestic use. So it was arranged for piano, four hands, for mom and pop to play together, or maybe the two sisters of the family, or what have you. Here is the front page of the piano version of Wellington's Victory, or the Battle of Victoria. That's a place in Spain. for the pianoforte by Ludwig van Beethoven, Opus 91. There's a regular, typical warlike scene of the time, somebody leading a cavalry charge. There's an old wagon wheel broken there and a couple of dead bodies lying around, you see. Beethoven could not quite, although he could compose potboilers, he could not quite suppress his own genius. And there are some episodes in this Battle Symphony that are really good. Just a few places where you say, oh yes, the hand of the master. But of course most of it is pretty shallow stuff. In this piano arrangement, which I have seen, a copy of it is in the Library of Congress, you will find a caption on the second or third page, something, the real battle is joined, after the bugle calls and commands are over. And there'll be a sign, it's a circle with a line through it. It's called English Cannon. Every time you see that sign, you're supposed to make a cannon shot. And then the other hand has another circle with two lines through it, and that's called French Cannon. Now, sometimes both are going at once, and you wonder how on earth this could be managed. Cannon shots were, if you had a giraffe piano, if you had one with all these condimentary pedals, you could do it with your feet. But these things were played on ordinary pianos too. So there was a composer who showed how to make a cannon shot. You would take the flat of your hand and play all the lowest notes of the piano fortissimo. You know, sometimes 5-year-old kids will do this just for the fun of it, but this was actually a specified way of making cannon shots. Now I would like to know, if you had to use one hand to make English cannon and another hand to make French cannon, who would play the rest of the music? See? Well, I don't know, it's one of these musical puzzles. All right, next, please. Well, we change our scene again. This is Paris. This is a program of Chopin's debut in Paris. He was a young man, fresh from this strange, faraway country, Poland, and he wasn't quite certain how his talents would stack up. He thought maybe, he was a little modest about it, he thought maybe he would ask some reigning celebrity there for lessons. Well, the reigning celebrity was a person named Kalkbrenner, a pianist of some ability. Kalkbrenner, who then also stayed in the business by becoming a member of the firm of piano makers of Pleyel and Company. Well, Kalkbrenner heard Chopin and realized that he couldn't teach him very much, but still was very kind to him and figured that this talented young Polish gentleman could be a feather in his cap in a way. So this concert was arranged in which Kalkbrenner sort of presented the new musician, the new interesting musician as the pièce de résistance. Now, I must tell you that in those years, there was quite a vogue then by that time, 1830, for multiple piano stunts. Two pianos, well, yes, this is old business. Mozart has written for two pianos. But two wouldn't be enough. You'd have 3, 4, 5, 6 pianos. This was quite a thing in the 1830s. And sure enough, it appears on this program. Here it is, Grand Concert, vocal and instrumental, by Mr. Frederick Chopin of Warsaw, the 15th of January, Sunday, 15th of January, 1832, at 8 o'clock in the evening, in the rooms of, the warerooms of Messrs. Pleyel and Company. Pleyel was the firm of which Kalkbrenner was an interested party. Begins, quintet composed by Beethoven, played by various string players, Bayeux, Vidal, Ullmann, and so forth. Duo, sung by Mrs. Tomeoni, and so forth. Then number 3, concerto for the piano, composed and played by Mr. F. Chopin in this song. So now look at the second part. Great Polonaise, preceded by an introduction and a march, composed for 6 pianos by Mr. Kalkbrenner and performed by Mr. Kalkbrenner, Mendelssohn Bartholdy. As it turned out, Mendelssohn did not play at the concert. He reneged or something, but he was at the audience. But he's on the announcement. Mendelssohn, Hiller, Osborne, Stravinsky, and Chopin. Stravinsky was another Polish pianist who lived in Paris at the time. 6 pianos, playing a Polonaise by Kalkbrenner. Well, I have read a letter that Chopin wrote to his parents about this. And he said, yes, we had 6 pianos, but they were not very good. They were mostly rattletraps. There was only one really decent piano among them, and Kalkbrenner hogged that one for himself. So, here you have more. Melody sung by Mademoiselle Isambert, solo on the oboe, and then finally, oh yes, Grande variation brillante sur un thème de Mozart, composé et exécuté by Monsieur F. Chopin. These are undoubtedly the Lacidarem La Mano variations by Chopin, his opus 2. Well, the thing that is interesting is to see the varied nature of this program. Almost all concerts in the end of the 18th and early 19th century were of this piebald kind. You couldn't really expect to get rich people away from their dinner tables and call a carriage and then offer them just one miserable violinist or pianist or singer. You had to give them a real 6-course dinner, you see, with singers from the opera, soprano and a tenor, and then maybe a solo on a wind instrument or so, and then your piano, your pièce de résistance, and so forth. And of course there had to be an orchestra. There had to be an orchestra. But this was the norm for concerts. Incidentally, concerts were in 2 parts in those days, just as they are today, with the intermission in between. All right, next. Well, this is a page from the leading music magazine of the period, Revue et Gazette Musicale, Paris. And these are advertisements of publications. And this illustrates how much of piano music was dependent on the opera. After all, as I say, who played this music? These were girls in well-to-do homes. And what was the great musical event of the world? It was the opera, especially in Paris. This was the favorite. That was not only an elaborate production, but look at the audience. Who was there? Oh, all kinds of bankers and shippers and rich people, all dolled up, and duchesses and countesses and foreign diplomats and so forth. A great event, social event, and the opera was wonderful and glamorous. So, what kind of music would you want to play at home? Well, something, some reflection, some shadow, some snippet from an opera, arranged so you could play it on the piano. Well, the great opera, the great triumph, the great opera of the decade was one by Meyerbeer called The Huguenots, Les Huguenots, something that celebrates the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics in Paris. It culminates in the great massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve and so forth. Well, here we are. Now look at the list. Adam, Czerny, Duvernois, Gallet, Hertz, Hinton, Laradon, Le Carpentier, Le Osborne, and so forth. Everybody, Schulke, Schwenke, Stravinsky, Thalberg, Tolbeck, Julien, all of them with arrangements, medleys of tunes from the Huguenots or similar operas. Look at that, Czerny, under Czerny, Opus 403, Rondo on the duet of the second act of the Huguenots. Opus 404, brilliant variations on a theme of the Huguenots. Opus 157, brilliant scherzo on the piff-poff of the Huguenots. I don't know what the piff-poff is. It's some kind of scene in there. And everything on the Huguenots. It's just an indication of the kind of music that was played on the piano and also on other instruments, it says there in the second part. This was the basis of the piano business. Next, please. This is a picture of the warerooms of the Pleyel Piano Company. And some of you will be interested in the decoration, the interior decor. And look at that ceiling. Isn't that something? And look at all those things on the walls, those ornaments and so forth. And look at the pianos. There's the uprights by this time get into vogue. Look at the dress of the lady there. You're beginning to see the hoop skirt is coming in again. I think this is in the 1850s. And look at the child with a triangle noisemaker down there. There's a picture of your great-grandparents or great-grandparents buying a piano. I think it's 1855. It says principal room of the succursale, that is the branch store, Rue Richelieu. Next. This is the famous Pleyel Hall, where Chopin played, gave recitals, many other celebrated pianists. I took the trouble to count these seats and the rows, and I think it holds about 400. I think this hall holds a little under 300. So you can just enlarge this hall by another quarter or a third, and you will have Pleyel Hall. But it was possible to make a European reputation by playing in this hall. Who came to these concerts? Oh, a lot of fancy people with handles to their names and so on. It's interesting to think of, well, the difference in emphasis as far as musical reputation is concerned those days and present. It would be hard to make a European reputation by playing in a hall of that size today. Chairs are pretty close together too, not really very comfortable. And look at the standing room. Apparently fire laws were not so drastic then as they are now. All right, next. Now, you get a status symbol, as the piano was, and then everybody wants it. But a lot of people want it who can't really afford it. So what do the business people do? Well, they make one, they make a small one, or a cheaper one that a lot of people can't afford. It's the same as the history of the automobile in this country. So, what with smaller living quarters, certain people devised a true upright piano. A true upright piano. This goes way back to the beginning of the 19th century. What's a true upright piano? Why is it different from an upright grand? Well, the whole piano is turned on its tail. In an upright piano, that end there is down on the floor. And then it sticks up like that, and the action does not strike from behind the strings, it strikes down. But it's a very different mechanism from the grand piano. And then, of course, once this space has been saved, why then somebody wants to go still further and save still more space. Make a miniature. Well, here was an inventor who made this tiny little piano, upright piano, it says, from the factory of Rollin Blanchet in Paris. Au roi, to the king. This is kingdom again after all the republics and Napoleons. This is Louis XVIII, I think, or Charles X. Bought for the apartments of His Majesty at the Exposition of the Products of Industry in 1827. Yes, that was Charles X, the last true Bourbon king. And look at the size of it. Look at the lady's head coming way up over the top of the piano. So these little spinets that you people have been buying here are nothing new. Nothing new at all. The piano has been stowed away in small boxes for a long time. The only thing that's different is the recess in front. You notice that her pedals are not out like this from the box. They're in a recess. And probably may have worked sideways, not from the front. The brass is probably pointing to the left or to the right. So, that way. Well, in addition to enjoying this little piano, I think the ladies will also enjoy the hat and the costume generally. She's dressed, of course, in the latest fashion, and look at the chair she's sitting on. Couldn't be just a simple piano bench or stool. Oh, no, that wouldn't be fancy enough. Not for the kind of people who might want to buy this. Of course, fashions change, and who knows, we may be getting back to this again. You think? You say no. Well, I don't know. I'm not too certain. After everything becomes forgotten, after nobody has ever heard of it anymore, then it comes up again, then it seems new. Might just as well be new. The latest wrinkle. Also the oldest. Next, please. Here we have some evidence of the piano in the United States. This is almost the first mention of a piano in the United States. That is, it was not yet the United States, it was the colonies. It's not quite the first. I still have the first. I have a small, insignificant notice. This is a letter of Thomas Jefferson. He was far from being president at the time. He was not even governor of Virginia. I think he was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. He was a young man and was thinking of getting married. He wanted to marry Martha Skelton. And like many American gentlemen in those days, manufactured articles and were imported usually from England. And he had an agent, Thomas Adams, who went abroad to buy things for him and for a lot of other people. And this is the second letter to Thomas Adams. If you get line, oh dear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The 10th line. He says, referring to his previous letter, I must alter one article in the invoice. I wrote therein for a clavichord. I have since seen a forte piano, and am charmed with it. Send me this instrument, then, instead of the clavichord, and let the case be of fine mahogany. What is that now? Something not veneered, solid, not veneered. That's right. Yes. The compass from double F to F, double G to F in alt, and plenty of spare strings, and the workmanship of the whole very handsome and worthy the acceptance of a lady for whom I intended. In other words, he was presenting Mrs. Skelton with this instrument. And the thing that's interesting is not just that he ordered a piano, but that he said, I have since seen a piano. The date is 1771 there, June 4th, 1771. Now, where before June 1771 did Jefferson see a piano in Virginia? I cannot find out. I made a superficial reconnaissance in Williamsburg some years ago, but I couldn't stay long enough to really investigate. The fact is that this is not absolutely the first mention of a piano in the United States. There is an announcement in a Boston paper that a local musician was giving a concert and was playing something called forte piano, only the printer, the newspaper printer, didn't know this word very well and stuck a comma between forte and piano. But there is, a few weeks before this letter, there is this announcement, the first one that I've been able to find. All right, next. I spoke of the battle pieces, and here you have the most famous and the most persistent, the most virulent, you might say, of all the battle pieces, the Battle of Prague. Now, there was such a battle which had taken place not in the Napoleonic days, but back in 1757, in the so-called 7 Years' War, in which the Prussians and were fighting the Austrians and the Russians and later the French. And this composer, this alleged composer, Kotzvara, was a mediocre viola player who got a job in the London theater, and who may have remembered this actual battle from his own childhood. Well, this piece got to be one of the most famous of all pieces of music. Why they picked out Prague, I don't know. It's got to be famous in English-speaking countries. It first came out in London, and then came across the ocean to the United States, and you hear of it every place where English was spoken. The continent of Europe did not take to it. They had battles of their own. But here, this Battle of Prague, which had happened 40 years or 35 years before the piece was composed, got to be the most popular of all. And we'll hear more of it later on. Here is an American edition, and look at the cannon on the title page and the flags and everything else. Next. Here's more. This is Punch, magazine Punch. And it's from the year 1845. 1845. Punch's penciling. Social Miseries, number 11. See? Look at Pa's expression there. The pleasures of folding doors. And underneath it says, hearing the Battle of Prague played with a running accompaniment of 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3. And look at Sister there. Look at the expression of her face. You know, I've seen something quite like that quite a number of times. People, that expression. And she has an upright grin there. Now, this is 1845. The piece was composed about 1792, I think. Can you imagine that? So this was still worth putting in a cartoon in Punch after 53 years. So that's a proof of the... Meanwhile, this piece is mentioned by Thackeray in Vanity Fair. Mark Twain talks about it. Well, that was even after this. Talks about it in his Tramp Abroad, I believe. And Thoreau speaks of it too. This is a very famous piece. It spooks, the name of it spooks in English literature for many generations. Next. Ha! Now we're getting some real Americana. Yes? Why do you have a musical and sewing machine gazette? Well, it's all explained down there. This is, the editor says, if two articles are associated in business, the same shop will sell you a piano or an organ and a sewing machine. Well, there ought to be a paper devoted to the whole business. He says, when in the natural course of trade 2 or 3 commodities are constantly associated with one another, it may reasonably be inferred that the association fulfills some useful purpose. Such an association exists between pianos, organs, and sewing machines, and so forth. Howard Lockwood is the publisher. Well, there is a connection between pianos and sewing machines. They're both objects that cost more than an ordinary daily purchase. They're both objects of some permanence. They cost more than 50 cents or a dollar or what you may be spending on groceries. And they're both objects that women like to play with around the house. Let's put it that way. So, it's not very different from the fact that you can go to a shop, a hardware store now, and you can buy a refrigerator, and the same shop will also sell you a radio set in which you can get your symphony orchestra or any kind of music that you want. It's not as crazy as it seems. It looks funny on the title. All right. This paper went on for about a year, and then it decided to change the name, and it was called the Musical and Sewing Machine Courier. This is 1880. Musical and Sewing Machine Courier. And then another year passed, and they decided that it didn't work. And they dropped the sewing machine angle, and it became the Musical Courier. And if you remember the Musical Courier, have you ever read it as a paper? This is it. It began as the sewing machine gazette. And then, of course, the management changed. The Lockwood dropped out, and a man named Blumenberg got into it. But here you have a piece of American history. I've never had a course in American history that ever taught this. All right, next. Oh, yes. Song of the Sewing Machine by Will S. Hayes. Hayes was composer of popular songs, and usually, he has one I think called Evangeline, and what happens to Evangeline? I'll give you one good guess. She's a sweet girl, and then what happens to her? She dies, of course, you're so right. Anyhow, this is something about a sewing machine, but when you turn to the words, I haven't got the slide of them, you'll find that there's a particular brand of sewing machine that's mentioned. The wonderful Florence machine, well, what is it? It's a singing commercial. It's a singing commercial from the year 1867 or 68. And there's a domestic scene there which illustrates the piano. There's Mama playing the sewing machine, and it's got Florence on it, Papa playing with the kids, and there's your square piano, which is the kind that was most in vogue in the United States. And the author of the music has got his name on the piano, Will S. Hayes. Yes. He came from Kentucky, I think. All right, next. Here. This kind of places the piano in its proper domestic environment. After all, you know, piano in a home was part of the home's coziness. This is part of family life. And what's wrong with advertising other things that pertain to family life along with the piano or with music? This is called the Musical Herald, and there you have sets of scales, and there you have an analysis of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, musical directory, and down below you have a new game, the Star Game of Cities, something like authors, you understand, and of course that intimate garment up there, that's all part of home life, and why not put it all together? See? This is 1880, I think. All right, next. Here is one of the most famous pieces of music. The Maiden's Prayer. Maiden's Prayer, which is a very sappy piece, and as I expect to be playing it for you later on, it's, I would say, the worst short piece ever composed. And it has, when I say worst, I don't mean the commonest or vulgarest. Not at all. A thing can be vulgar and rowdy and still be very good, very fascinating. This is just poor stuff. Dowdy, tacky, done by a rank amateur, an incompetent amateur. See? All right. This was composed by a Polish girl, Tekla Bondarzewska. Well, now, about 1860. I can find out nothing about her. I've never been able to find out any details, except that she died young. She died at the age of 24, and I'll give you one really shrewd guess. What did she die of? Now, this is a real girl. This is not literary. What did she die of? Consumption. You have it. Absolutely. This is it. Yeah. Consumption was very fashionable in the 19th century. They still haven't used tuberculosis. This is not a nice word. This is an ugly, mean word. Consumption, that might be things. Okay, now I have made collections of editions of the Maiden's Prayer. This piece has had an extraordinary long life. It's incredible. This was composed about 1860, and I still bought a copy in print about 1940. I think it's gone now. For 80 years, this miserable piece of music moved around in all parts of the world. Now, this piece is not catchy, it's not showy, it's not easy to play, it's not something that anybody can play, it's rather difficult. There's some octaves in it that are difficult. Why should a piece of music that has literally nothing to recommend it, why should that last for 80 years? Well, I've come to the conclusion it's not a piece of music. It's a title. That's all. It's just a set of words. A Maiden's Prayer. What is she praying for? You know, this kind of thing. The answer to the Maiden's Prayer. It's a title which drags a few notes behind it. Now, what you probably don't know is that there is an answer to the Maiden's Prayer. There is one, composed by the same composer. Only you never hear of it. What's the matter with the answer? Oh, well, it's too definite. It drops dead. All right, it's answered then. And you don't pray anymore. Then you see, then that's... All right, next. Now that was 1860. You notice that girl's face. She's really praying. Could we have the previous one back again just a little bit? She's really praying. There's a prie-dieu, as they call it, and that window conceivably could be in a chapel or in a church. And look at that nice vanilla pudding face she has there. She's really praying. This is 1860. Now the next picture is 1910, I think. And it's the same music. Go on. Next now, please. Oh, there, yes. Now, that's not quite the same kind of a face. She's dreaming there, and she's holding a book, but are you sure that's a prayer book? Now, that may be a book of poetry or something like that. She's got her hair down like that. This is 1910. There's a difference in general fashion. The music is the same, I assure you. Now, the next picture is going to be 1936. Now, don't look out now, look out. Well, this cocktail girl but the music is the same, I'm telling you. All right, enough of that. I'll play you the Major's Prayer later on. Come on, next. Well, we can get serious again. Inventions on the piano sort of went into on a plateau after about the middle of the 19th century. Piano was pretty well finished. Nothing of any great importance was added to it. Well, a few things were tried. One thing that was tried was a reform of the keyboard that was made by a Hungarian nobleman named Adalbert von Janko. And this is a very radical change in piano keyboard arrangements. Instead of building it in C major, simply alternate half steps up and down. Now, what you saw on the slide, I don't know if you looked at it carefully, it looked as if it had 3 keyboards. It's not 3 keyboards, it's 3 striking places on the same keyboard. It looks like 3, there are indeed 3 different sets of ivory, but each one of them operates the same lever. It's not 3 different keys, it's 1 key with 3 places to strike. This, of course, is quite an advantage. In the shape of the hand, you realize that the thumb is in a different position from the other keys. But the main thing is the fact that this keyboard is arranged in alternate semitones. And when you play a glissando, you do not get a C major scale. You get a whole tone scale. If you play a glissando, you get this. Or if you begin, or whatever the thing is, on either one. Now, if the keys are arranged alternately like this, that means that all scales have the same fingering. They all have the same fingering. That's something of an advantage. Then, of course, if your octave has 6 white keys instead of 7, well, of course, it's that much shorter, isn't it? And your stretch is increased thereby. Then as for these 3 striking places, there are a great many places where you can play more fluently if you play certain notes a little bit lower and certain ones a little higher. The Janko keyboard was very practically designed and an excellent invention. It came out about 1886, and it's very instructive, not just for itself, but for its history. Here's an excellent invention made by a man who was a graduate both of the engineering school and the music school, Count von Janko. He was both an engineer and a musician. And here you have an excellent invention which never succeeded. Never succeeded. And this in itself is a very instructive thing. When I say never succeeded, I didn't mean that it didn't work. It worked. Of course it worked. But you had to learn how to play it. The reason it didn't succeed is that too much capital, too much labor, thought has been invested in the old keyboard. I don't mean manufacturing, I mean thinking, skill. Millions of people can play the old keyboard, and let's say you're 25 years old, not very old, but you still have already been spending a good part of your life learning how to play this keyboard, this C major keyboard. You'd have to learn how to play all over again. Well, there were just a very few people who would learn how to play all over again as adults. But let's say you were a child. Let's say you were 7 years old or 8, and you learned your little pieces, your Mary Had a Little Lamb or what have you, on a Janko keyboard. Well, that's all right, but if you went over to see Cousin Susie, and then she said, play us a tune, why, you wouldn't know how to play. You couldn't play anybody else's piano. Or if the local Sunday school said, why don't you play something for us at our spring entertainment, you couldn't play. You'd have to learn on this funny keyboard. So the Yanko keyboard simply could not get itself established. It was invented by this man, this distinguished gentleman in Budapest, but it was brought to this country about 1890 or so, or 1888, and was taken up by a piano firm in New York, Decker Brothers. And if you ever see a Yanko keyboard in America, it'll probably be on a Decker piano. I've only seen two in my life, both of them in Washington, D.C. That slide I showed you was a picture of myself playing it, and a little girl standing next to me. The little girl is a stranger. I don't know who she is. That piano is to be found in a settlement house in Washington. I cannot now remember the name of it, but it's on the southwest side. There is another Yanko keyboard in Washington, which I saw only about a week or two ago. That is in the Smithsonian Institution, which has a remarkable collection of musical instruments. If any of you ever get to Washington and you keep up your interest in instruments, I suggest that you go there. The collection is not really yet in shape. Perhaps you'd better wait till next year. But you will find some of these pianos that I showed you in the slides there. You will find a giraffe, and you will find an upright grand with silk in front of it, and you will find a Decker Brothers Yanko keyboard. So, although it's more practical in many ways than our regular keyboard, it has not been a success. I think you'll have a hard time ever converting Americans to the decimal system. It's about the same thing. No doubt the decimal system is simpler, more practical than the system that we have now. The 12 inches and the 3 feet and the 1,760 yards and all that. It's much easier to say 10 millimeters make a centimeter, 10 centimeters make 100 centimeters make a meter, 1,000 meters is a kilometer, and so forth. That's all much simpler, but it will never happen here. Too many people are used to the old ways. They're trying to introduce the decimal currency in England now, but I think they're striking snags. You will not get the Japanese to give up the Chinese characters, the ideographs. The ideographs are a pain in the neck, not only for us that had to learn them, for foreigners, but even for the Japanese themselves. But they're used to them. They've learnt them for untold generations in school, and they will not change to the Roman alphabet. So we will not adopt the Yanko keyboard. It's too bad. Maybe sometime in the dim future, when our whole culture is gone, everything is destroyed, and then some bright fellow in the year 8,000 or something will think up the idea of making music on a keyboard. And then maybe it'll be done the Yanko way. I don't know. Well, that's all that I have on my slides. Now, there remain the pieces that I said I would play for you, and I have them here. As I threatened before, these are the two, in my opinion, the two worst pieces ever composed. The worst long piece and the worst short piece. The worst long piece is the Battle of Prague. And I think I gave you an inkling of that. It's curious how this thing became perpetuated. The Battle of Prague aroused no particular patriotism among English people. They had nothing to do with it. And it never had any vogue on the European continent, but by just accidental concatenation of circumstances, it got to be talked of and played by people in England, United States, I'm sure India, Australia, and so forth. It was arranged for 4 hands. Originally, I think it was composed to be accompanied by a drum, which would be very appropriate. But what we have here are just straight piano versions. The piece finally did die. There was an attempt made to revive it during the Civil War here in the United States. And somewhere at home I have a late edition. Now, the events of this battle are all carefully noted in the score here. And I'll play it as best I can. And I'll call out the captions when they come. I'll probably cut some of it out. It's really too awful. I mean, it isn't just how awful it is in quality, it just lasts too long, that's all. It ends up by being a deadly bore. It starts with Slow March. Imperialists, meaning Austrians. Prussians begin to waver. Attacked with swords, and the left hand has horses galloping. Trumpet, dragoons advancing. Heavy cannonade. of the wounded. Of victory. And of course, then, of course, you have to have, after victory, you have a victory ball, always. So here we are, Turkish quick step. Which is something the same. And so on and so on. And now comes a very funny thing. The thing stops and there is a single note with a rhythm with the words, "Go to bed, Tom." Now, I don't know what that is. I don't know why that should be in here. But I played this for a Canadian audience once, and a man said, later told me, yes, there was some kind of funny little parlor trick called "Go to Bed, Tom," where you lifted up your hands and clapped both of them. And it was called "Go to Bed, Tom." And why that should be in here, I don't know. Go to bed, Tom. Go to bed, Tom. And then it comes back to that little jig there. And so on. And finally, that's it. Now, the fact that this is a horrible, a terrible piece of music is not important. It's all kinds of people think they can compose music. There's nothing to that. But that this thing should keep going for 50 or 60 years and be arranged for orchestra and for piano four hands and get into literary works such as Thackeray's Vanity Fair, all this kind of, this is the remarkable thing. Something so poor should have such a vogue. I mean poor. I don't mean common, vulgar, rowdy, or anything like that. That might have some life to it. This is just flimsy. This is just poor stuff. And not only that, it doesn't even have any interesting associations for the people who played it. Now, if it were Waterloo instead of the Battle of Prague, all right, this might mean something to English people. But this Battle of Prague, actually, I'd say this piece was a good example of the completely superstitious nature of fame. All right, now you've heard the worst long piece, and now we come to the worst short piece, which I've told you before is the Maiden's Prayer. Oh, there's some of these covers I haven't shown you on the slides. Here's another one. Come on up closer, you'll see it. This is 1930-something. Always the same music. Always the same music for 80 years. I'll see which copy I'll play it from. Well, I'll play the Cocktail Girl. Notice how I play that left hand. No nice girl ever plays a chord together like that. Boy, that'd be like accepting, saying yes the first time when she's offered something. Oh, you don't ever do that. You say no, and then you get to be coached. So your chords are always rolled and broken. And it looks kind of elegant. All right, then comes again. I think I'm playing those arpeggios too well. No, let's do it again. Breaking a chord is something of a skill too. There's a nice way of breaking it, but some of the gals would make lumps like that. Well, I'll leave the next repetition out. It's just too much of a bore. Oh, well, did you notice in the Battle of Prague, you cross hands? This goes down big with children and other inexperienced people. So you always try to cross hands. What happens? Nothing happens. It goes over the same another variant until you finally get to the last one. Don't tell me you're laughing. You ought to be weeping. Well, you've heard the worst short piece ever played, but here, this thing went on for 80 years. 80 years, yes. I was teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Music one summer in the 1930s, I think it was, and a woman came in for an audition and played me this piece seriously. It happened. Again, so don't get too excited when something becomes well-known or famous or in vogue or what. Just don't get too excited about this. It's easy advice, I suppose, for an older person to give, but it's okay. When you nice thing that happens to you when you get old is you've seen a lot of things come and go. And, of course, if you're too young, all you do is you see them either come or go. But when you're old enough, you see them come and go. And it gives you a somewhat different point of view about most anything. Anyhow, you've heard the music. Your great-grandmother's favorites. Now, what will your great-grandchildren think of your favorites?